You cannot just talk your way out of trauma, because trauma is not a memory in your mind. It is a glitch that has hijacked your physical hardware. That is the core argument of "the body keeps the score" by Bessel van der Kolk, which we are decoding today on Nonfiction Insights.
And that is a massive structural claim to make right out of the gate. I mean, the entire foundation of modern psychiatric care is built on the assumption that we treat mental health through language and chemical balancing. We use cognitive behavioral therapy, we ask patients to narrate their past, we prescribe SSRIs. If van der Kolk is right, if trauma is fundamentally a hardware failure, are you arguing that the standard medical model of talk therapy is completely useless for these patients?
We are going to audit the human nervous system today to find out exactly that. The mission of this deep dive is to prove that post-traumatic stress disorder is not a psychological software bug. You have to understand that trauma creates a physiological loop in your present biological state. It all comes down to what we can call the time perception glitch. In a healthy nervous system, you experience a threat, your brain processes it, files it away as a historical event, and your body returns to a baseline state of safety. But in a traumatized system, that filing process fails completely. The event isn't stored as something that happened in the past. The body learns that the danger never ends, so it stores the trauma as something that is currently, constantly happening.
So if it is a permanent glitch where the past is physically fusing with the present, what does that mean for the last 50 years of cognitive therapy? We have spent decades asking survivors, combat veterans, abuse victims to sit in a chair and retell their stories to process the memory. Are you saying that clinical approach is actively misguided?
In many cases, it is structurally incompatible with the state of the patient's nervous system. When van der Kolk was working with Vietnam veterans at the VA early in his career, he noticed something alarming. Asking these men to retell their combat experiences didn't heal them. It didn't help them process the event. Instead, the retelling just reactivated the exact same physiological loop. Their heart rate spiked, they started sweating, their bodies braced for an attack. They felt fully alive only when they were revisiting the past. But the words weren't resolving the trauma. It was just forcing the hardware to run the same ruinous survival program over and over again.
That contradicts almost everything the public understands about therapy. If talking triggers the loop instead of closing it, we need to look under the hood of the biology here. Language centers literally turn off during a trauma response. Because if you're going to claim the brain's hardware overrides the conscious mind, I need to know if this is just a poetic metaphor for being overwhelmed, or if this is something visible on a brain scan.
It is entirely visible. But to understand the scan, we have to look at the three engines of your survival circuitry from first principles. First, you have the thalamus. Think of it as the cook. It takes all the raw sensory input from your environment, the sights, the smells, the sounds, and stirs them into a coherent soup of your autobiographical reality. Now, once the cook mixes that soup, it serves it in two different directions. It sends it up the high road to the cortex, which is your rational conscious brain. But, and this is the critical part, it also sends it down the low road to the amygdala.
And I am assuming the amygdala is the alarm system, the smoke detector, acting much faster than the rational brain.
Exactly. The low road is milliseconds faster. The amygdala assesses the environment for threats and floods the body with stress hormones before the rational brain has even finished processing what it's looking at. In a traumatized system, the smoke detector becomes hypersensitized. It starts interpreting benign triggers, a specific tone of voice, a sudden movement, as lethal immediate threats. So the survival circuitry overrides the entire body before the high road can step in and say, hey, that's just a car backfiring, not a gunshot.
But doesn't the brain have a mechanism to shut off a false alarm? There has to be a regulatory system that steps in to stop the amygdala from just endlessly dumping adrenaline into the bloodstream.
There is, and that is the second engine, the medial prefrontal cortex, or the watchtower. Its entire job is to look down at the smoke detector and dampen the alarm when the threat isn't real. But trauma physically alters this mechanism. In traumatized individuals, the watchtower essentially goes dark. It fails to inhibit the amygdala, and that leads to the third engine, which is the unplugged monitor. During states of extreme hyperarousal, the rational, language-generating part of the brain is effectively disconnected from the body's physical response.
Okay, stop right there, the unplugged monitor. I need the clinical evidence for that, because in psychiatric practice, we see patients take Rorschach tests or encounter minor triggers, and they suddenly go numb or fly into an inexplicable rage. But they can't articulate why. They have no narrative for it. So show me the empirical proof that the narrative mind is actually physically unplugged during those moments.
The irrefutable proof arrived in 1996 with a landmark study by Dr. Scott Rauch. They designed an experiment where they took traumatized patients, placed them inside a PET scanner to monitor their brain's blood flow and oxygen utilization, and then played an audio script recounting their specific traumatic event. They induced a physiological flashback while watching the hardware operate in real time.
And what exactly lit up on the monitor when the flashback hit? Because if the watchtower is offline, the scan should show a complete asymmetry in how the brain is functioning.
That is exactly what they found. The right hemisphere of the brain, the side responsible for intense emotion, visual imagery, and spatial awareness, lit up bright red. The emotional intensity was massive, but the left hemisphere crashed. Specifically, a region called Broca's area went completely dark.
Broca's area is the speech center. That is the exact piece of neural real estate responsible for turning internal experience into external language.
Right, and the physiological effect of trauma on Broca's area in that scanner mimicked the exact same blood flow drop you would see in a stroke patient. This is the biological definition of speechless terror. The brain literally, physically loses the capacity to generate language or sequence time when the survival circuitry is hijacked. The left brain is the timekeeper. When it goes offline, you lose the ability to tell yourself the danger is in the past.
If language is offline, if the biological speech center goes dark during a trigger, how does a therapist even begin to communicate to initiate clinical treatment? You are dealing with a patient whose hardware has structurally blocked the reception of words.
You can't. And that is why Kolk uses the keyboard analogy. Trying to perform traditional talk therapy, like CBT, on a patient who is in a state of hyperarousal is like furiously typing on a keyboard when the computer monitor is unplugged. The hardware, the survival brain, the amygdala is screaming that it is under attack. The software, the rational narrative mind, isn't receiving any of your inputs because the connection has been biologically severed. You cannot reason with a system that has already released a flood of cortisol.
Which forces a rather uncomfortable realization about the history of psychiatry. Has the medical model spent the last 50 years charging vulnerable people to sit in rooms and type on unplugged keyboards? Because if we're using the high road of logic to try and fix a low-road survival problem, the entire therapeutic architecture is fundamentally misaligned.
It is misaligned, and that misalignment is what we call architectural myopia. The modern medical system is optimized for billing codes and diagnostic manuals, not for repairing human nervous systems. Because the system can't easily bill for an unplugged monitor, it slows a single massive hardware failure into a dozen different manageable symptoms.
Give me an example of how that myopia plays out in a clinical diagnosis. How is the system mislabeling the hardware glitch?
Think about a child who grows up in a highly chaotic, unpredictable environment. Their smoke detector is permanently stuck on high alert. When they go to school and overreact to a teacher's instruction, the medical system doesn't say, this child has a hyper-aroused amygdala. It slaps them with an oppositional defiant disorder label. An adult whose nervous system copes with trauma by shutting down entirely gets labeled with major depression. Someone whose watchtower is constantly scanning the room for threats gets diagnosed with ADHD. We treat the downstream symptoms and ignore the foundational system failure.
But I have to defend the pharmacological side of the medical model here. Don't SSRIs and other psychiatric medications save thousands of lives precisely by artificially lowering that alarm? If the amygdala is screaming and a pill turns the volume down so the person can function, go to work, and raise their kids, isn't that a valid fix for the hardware?
It is a Band-Aid, not a reset. Medications can absolutely blunt the system. They can turn down the volume of the smoke detector to keep the patient alive and functioning. But they do not resolve the physiological loop. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, the ACE study, proved that hidden trauma is arguably the single largest public health crisis we face, driving chronic disease, addiction, and depression. And we are just throwing chemical blankets over the smoke alarm instead of putting out the fire. To show you how deeply ingrained this loop is, consider a case study of a woman named Marcia.
What happened with her nervous system?
Marcia lost her children in a horrific car accident. 13 years after the event, researchers placed her in a scanner and exposed her to the memory. Her heart rate and blood pressure instantly spiked to the exact same levels as if the accident were happening right then in the room. Her left brain entirely failed to tell her amygdala that 13 years had passed. Her autonomic nervous system was still trapped in the wreckage of the car. No amount of SSRIs or talk therapy had managed to update her time perception.
13 years of the body fighting a ghost. If the conscious mind is locked out and chemical blunting doesn't cure the loop, we need a different diagnostic tool. We need a way to measure the hardware's status without relying on the patient's narrative. How do you monitor a system that refuses to speak?
You have to look at the dashboard of the nervous system, which is HRV, or heart rate variability. It is the ultimate metric for how rigidly or flexibly your hardware is operating. Your autonomic nervous system is essentially a seesaw between two states. When you inhale, you activate the sympathetic nervous system, that is the gas pedal, the fight or flight response. When you exhale, you activate the parasympathetic nervous system through the vagus nerve, that is the brake, the rest and digest state.
So a healthy system should be constantly oscillating between the gas and the brake based on the immediate environment.
Precisely. A healthy system has high HRV, it fluctuates dynamically, it can hit the gas to deal with the challenge and then immediately hit the brake to recover. But a traumatized system is incredibly rigid. It has very low HRV. The brake line is practically cut. The heart rate stays elevated, the muscles stay tense, and the breathing is shallow. And this leads to a massive societal problem, because trauma combined with the way we live today acts as a disembodiment machine.
A disembodiment machine. Are you talking about the loss of physical sensation or something more systemic about how we interact with the world?
Both. To survive the overwhelming sensations of trauma, people learn to completely ignore their gut feelings and physical sensations. They sever the connection to their own biology because the signals are too painful. They lose what is called interoception, the ability to accurately feel and interpret what is happening inside their own bodies. If you don't know what you are feeling, you cannot regulate it.
If a lack of interoception creates a dysregulated system, look at the 2020s digital economy. We spend our days completely severed from our physical reality, staring at screens, absorbing high-stress information while sitting perfectly still. Is the modern digital lifestyle inflicting a low-grade population-wide trauma by acting as a mass disembodiment machine?
It is absolutely eroding our baseline interoception. We are becoming a society of floating heads, completely disconnected from our physiological state. And a population that cannot feel its own body is a population that swings wildly between extreme rage and total dissociation. When you lack internal signals for safety, you become highly reactive and incredibly easy to manipulate. You are constantly living outside your window of tolerance.
Then let's solve the engineering problem. If we have a population suffering from hardware failures, and we know that top-down interventions like talk therapy are hitting the brick wall of an offline Broca's area, how do you fix it? How do you reconnect the monitor to the keyboard?
You have to use bottom-up regulation. If you cannot talk to the amygdala through logic, you must communicate with it through the language it actually understands. Physical sensation, breath, and movement. You have to bypass the skepticism of the rational mind entirely.
Give me the actual clinical interventions. What physical inputs successfully reprogram the survival circuitry?
One of the most effective and perhaps surprising is yoga. And I don't mean yoga as a casual stretching exercise. I mean the rigorous clinical practice of learning to tolerate physical sensations. Kolk cites a study where traumatized patients use yoga to practice noticing their internal state without running away from it. The results were stunning. The yoga intervention improved HRV and reduced PTSD symptoms significantly more than dialectical behavior therapy, which is a premier gold standard talk and skills-based treatment.
So a physical practice of breathing and postural awareness outperformed a clinical psychiatric therapy in a controlled setting. That is a massive paradigm shift. What about EMDR? The eye movement therapy always sounds slightly like pseudoscience, but does it actually interface with the hardware?
It is pure hardware manipulation. EMDR, or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, requires the patient to move their eye side-to-side tracking a finger or a light while briefly recalling the trauma. That bilateral stimulation taxes the working memory. It forces the left and right hemispheres to constantly communicate, which prevents the left brain, the timekeeper, from shutting down. By keeping the monitor plugged in during the recall, the brain is finally able to take that traumatic memory, process it, and file it away as an event that happened in the past.
It literally keeps the time sequencing hardware online while the file is being transferred. That is brilliant.
It is. And we see similar bottom-up healing in communal rhythm and theater. Trauma fundamentally breaks your social engagement system. It isolates you. But when you engage in communal movement, whether that is drumming in a circle, singing in a choir, or participating in theater, you are matching your physical rhythms with other human beings. That synchrony signals profound safety to the primitive brain in a way that words simply cannot achieve.
I have to concede the point. When you lay out the neurobiology, the fact that Broca's area goes dark, that HRV becomes completely rigid, that the amygdala hijacks the nervous system before the cortex even registers the threat, it is impossible to view trauma as just a bad memory. It is unequivocally a hardware issue. The cure has to be visceral, not just verbal.
And that is the ultimate insight you need to take away from this analysis. True healing isn't thinking differently. It's convincing your biological hardware that it is finally safe to reconnect the monitor. You have to teach the body that the war is actually over. If you want more deep dives into the unseen systems that govern your reality, make sure to subscribe to the channel.
We will keep prosecuting the evidence.
This has been Nonfiction Insights.